This video is sponsored by NordVPN. Hello again. 'Tis October, and the spooky season is upon us. Can't say that I'm incredibly excited. When it comes to scary things, I'm a rather timid person. I go out of my way to avoid any sort of horror film or video game, even something as cheap as a jump scare tends to freak me out. But I think that's why encountering horror elements in non-horror franchises is even more traumatizing. I mean, if you go to the theater to watch a scary movie, you go in with the expectation of being scared, which ends up making it less scary. Many people probably grew up with the fear of pianos thanks to Super Mario 64. For me, it was that big manta ray thingy in Super Mario Sunshine, along with the giant eel deep beneath the waters of Noki Bay. And it got me thinking. The Zelda series is filled with numerous enemies which most certainly fit the horror genre. But which enemy is scariest? Well, it shouldn't surprise you that the answer to this question varies from person to person, and my opinions are no more objective than anyone else's. Then again, it's difficult to say with certainty which I believe is scariest. The first game that comes to mind, at least for me, is Twilight Princess. It's the one with the most gritty and realistic art style. Even an enemy as basic as a choo-choo is rather unsettling. It's the only design in the series that lacks eyes, and the way it merges with others to get bigger makes me think of that entity from The Blob, or the Plasm Wraith of Pikmin 3. Ooh. When I really think about it though, there's nothing from Twilight Princess which I'd say is a valid candidate for scariest enemy. And I believe it's because of the previous point about going to the theater to watch a horror film. Since Twilight Princess is by default a darker game visually, you're conditioned to have less of a reaction whenever something truly scary shows up. It might still give you a bit of a spook, but at this point you're used to it. In contrast to this, there's The Wind Waker, a game full of vibrant colors which as a result makes those eerie moments a whole lot more unsettling. Not to say that there aren't scary enemies in this game, the Big Poes in particular are by far the scariest design-wise when compared to others, and it doesn't even come close. But what happens when you take the concept of a Big Poe and amp it up by 100? You get Death Sword, an evil spirit so terrifying it was sealed away in Arbiter's grounds. Some believe that the design of Death Sword was loosely based off of the demon Azazel, and even now the origins of this mini-boss aren't clear. But if you are interested in that discussion, there is a whole video covering Arbiter's grounds on my channel. Much of the terror factor of both Death Sword and the Big Poes, however, comes from their appearance, and, well, unless you somehow manage to get the power to transform into a wolf or other canine, most wouldn't even see these entities. Sure, you may get scared from the floating lanterns and occasional movement of objects, but ghosts are so frequent in Hyrule that no one would bat an eye. On the other hand, the Shadow Beasts resemble the sort of thing only your nightmares could manifest, paired with that eerie, repetitive theme that plays whenever Link fights the Shadow Beasts. And unless you take all of them down at once, it screams not unlike the Redeads, reviving its fallen brethren. But I don't know. Once you discover that they're innocent Twilight people corrupted by Xant's evil magic to do his bidding, rather than being scared, you start to feel bad for them. What's worse is how, even after this revelation, you're still forced to kill them. I've seen my share of top 10 scariest enemies lists, and often one of these spots goes to the Shadow Beasts or the previously mentioned Death Sword, along with another Twilight Princess mini-boss. But before that, a question for you all. Have you ever used Tinder? Why are you looking at me like that? No. It's not a segue into today's sponsor, I promise. Okay, well, there is a sponsor for this video, but it's not right now. Look, just roll with me on this, okay? Let's say that you were single, which obviously none of you are. This is only a hypothetical scenario, and certainly not a way for me to project my own loneliness onto others. What was I talking about again? Oh, right, so you're on Tinder, pretending that you're single, and you see this beautiful little dumpling muffin on your screen. It's love at first sight. Lives rather far away on a cold mountaintop, but hey, it's a mansion, meaning that she's not only cute, but also rich. You risk your life journeying to its peak, and the first thing she does is lead you to her bedroom. You can't believe it. Is this the lucky break you've been looking for? She stops moving. She stands in front of the mirror for a brief moment. and all of a sudden she turns around and Psych! Sweet Hylia? Ugh, not again. Why, oh why do I keep getting catfished like this? First it was the fake Princess Zelda, and now this. But when I really think about it, aside from the jump scare at the start of this battle, nothing else really screams scary enemy to me. For the whole duration of the boss fight, she's encased in this mass of ice. One of the series' scariest moments? Definitely. Scariest enemy, though? Nah. If you want childhood to be truly traumatizing, though, just try to steal the orb from this totally non-suspicious hand. Go on, take it. I dare you. Got it? Good. Now bring it back to the dungeon's entrance. Oh, this isn't actually so bad. Ah yes, the Zant hand. The thing which my childhood feared so much, I legit forgot this was even a thing until I went back and replayed the HD remaster. Part of me wonders if that was my dissociative amnesia kicking in. If this list was solely about Twilight Princess enemies, the Zant hand would most likely be my #1 pick. That or probably the Shadow Beasts. But, I don't know, when it comes to the whole series, there are scarier candidates to choose from. The hand doesn't even move that fast, and it's easy to stun it with your bow or hook shot. Even if it does get the orb, you got plenty of time to snatch it back. If anything, it's more so an inconvenience or frustration. Plus, does it even count as an enemy? I guess so? I mean, it only ever targets the orb, so unless you happen to be close to it, the player will never get damaged. I had this exact same conundrum with Majora's Mask's aliens. I'm sorry, I mean... them. The ones who come at night and steal the ranch's cows. It's never made clear what they are, but the most likely answer is that they're just this game's depiction of aliens. At first, you can't access the ranch until the morning of the final day, where Romani can be found wandering around and behaving strangely. You can go to the ranch earlier if you use a powder keg on the boulder blocking the path, and if you're there on the first night, they will appear at 2:30 a.m. If any one of them gets to the barn where Romani's hiding, both her and the cows will be abducted. On the second day, she'll be back at the ranch, although any further conversation with her will result in silence. On the third day, though, she'll talk to you, and her response suggests that her memories were wiped or whatever was done to her. Okay, enough with the whispering. It's a very eerie and unsettling side quest. The aliens themselves appear to be based off of the Flatwoods monsters. But what makes this moment truly terrifying isn't the design of the creatures themselves, rather the fact that failing this mission leads to the abduction of Romani and her cows, and the almost lifeless husk of a girl which is left behind. Comparing them side by side, quote-unquote, they have a lot of stuff in common with the Zant hand. Both entities can be damaged, while their targets aren't Link himself. Overall, I'd say that the aliens are much scarier, but a lot of this has to do with the fact that it relies on the whole alien abduction trope. Like Blizzetta, this is something that falls under the creepy moments sort of list. But I do acknowledge it as our first honorable mention. Congratulations, them, for your hard work towards solidifying yourself as one of the eeriest things in the Zelda series. And all it took was the traumatizing of a young girl. Aren't you proud of yourself? On the topic of Majora's Mask, oh yeah, if you couldn't tell, that was a segue into Majora's Mask's enemies. Aren't I so good at these scripts? Like Twilight Princess, this game has a much darker atmosphere, although in this case it's more thematically than visually. Many designs of even the regular enemies are more creepy. I think this is the only game in the series which managed to make the Choo-Choos with eyes look terrifying. Another scary-ish enemy is the Stone Tower Temple's mini-boss. In many ways, Gomez resembles the Grim Reaper. But this wouldn't be a Scary Enemies video if I weren't to include the dancing man himself, Majora. But we never get to see its true form, and the quote-unquote scariest form isn't even that scary, at least in my opinion. For me, it's more so about the mask. It has these tendrils coming from the back, and you can't help but wonder if when Skull Kid first put the mask on, those tendrils wrapped around his head, permanently fusing him to the mask, not unlike what you'd see in Lovecraftian-styled horror. Even thinking about it gives me chills. And I know what everyone's thinking now. Already 5 pages into the script and we haven't even gotten to our first candidate, but trust me, this is where things get very spooky. Quick question, have any of you used NordVPN? No, this time it actually is about today's sponsor. Currently there's this deal where you can sign up and get a huge discount plus 4 additional months for free. And all you have to do is go to the link in the description, nordvpn.com/NintendoBC. Sure, the Zelda series can get rather scary at times, but nothing scarier than having your private information stolen. A virtual private network, more commonly referred to as a VPN, encrypts any sort of data you enter when connecting to public networks. Sometimes these quote-unquote public networks are even created by random people who try to masquerade it as an official network, which ends up giving them access to the private information of whoever connects to it. First, you install NordVPN's app on either your phone or computer, or both. A single account can be connected to up to 6 devices. Next, select what server to connect to, such as one within Canada or the US, but in total there are 60 different countries to choose from. And you're finished. At any time, you're free to change servers, all it takes is a single click. A link to this limited time offer will be in the description as well as on the screen right now. That's nordvpn.com/NINTENDOBC. And now back to spooky things. Ocarina of Time is a classic. I can't tell you how many times I've gone back to replay the 3DS remake, and if it weren't for Breath of the Wild, it would probably be my most replayed game in the entire series. While it might not seem as dark as our previous 2 titles, some of the most iconic and, dare I say, horrific enemies stem from this game. And what better one to talk about than the Redeads? Sweet Hylia, what was that? Oh, it's just Frank. Hey Frank! You're looking awfully slim today. Been eating well? Alright Frank, talk to you later. As I was saying, if you've ever been in a discussion with friends about scary things in Zelda, chances are that one of the first things which is brought up are the Redeads. Even now it's unclear what they are, although many like to compare them to the traditional zombie. And it makes sense, they move slowly and visually resemble something akin to an animated corpse. Naturally, I consider them to be our first official candidate in this competition, but which Redead in particular is scariest? The most obvious choice would be the Ocarina of Time version, and honestly I wouldn't be surprised if this was the popular pick. But what exactly is it about this Redead that makes it so scary? Frank, would you shut up for a moment? What was I talking about again? Ah, right. It's that bone-chilling scream it lets out whenever you get too close to it. In fact, it's so terrifying that Link is literally frozen in place for a good couple seconds. And if this thing gets too close to you, it latches on and does Hylia only knows what to you. The first time you find this creature, it's under the royal family's grave. However, it's the scene that awaits you at Castletown which is truly terrifying. Once you travel 7 years into the future, you're left wondering whether these things killed some of the folk at Castletown, or if they are the residents of Castletown. While the Redeads only appear in 3 other games, they share many similarities with certain Gibdos. The Gibdo in Majora's Mask are essentially a Redead covered in cloth. They share the same traits as Redeads, as well as the same in-game model once that cloth is burned off. But not all Gibdos have that shrill scream. At most, the only similarity between them is the mummy-like appearance, with the exception of Tears of the Kingdom's Gibdo. In this game, they're much more insect-like. When I first saw this design, I was convinced that they'd blow the Ocarina of Time ones out of the water in terms of scariness, but unfortunately, I was rather underwhelmed by them. I still remember my first encounter with them. For funsies, I went to Hyrule Castle's depths after only completing 1 story dungeon, and the second I found this hole accompanied by 3 of them, I was too scared to approach and ended up just spamming bomb arrows. My first reaction was, huh, that was rather easy. But when I gathered enough courage to approach one of the Gibdos stationed in Gerudo Town, I stood there, waiting to hear that iconic shriek, only for it to never happen. They just slowly walk up to you while also having the slowest attack buildup, giving you plenty of time to dodge. In fact, the only time I felt any sort of fear was when I saw the speed at which they go when on all 4s, as well as my initial shock once I found out that these Gibdos can also fly. But unfortunately, they don't even come close to the original ones. Neither do Twilight princesses. Gameplay-wise, they're nearly identical to Ocarina of Time's, but rather than wrapping themselves around Link, these Gibdos attack with swords. When it comes to monsters in the horror genre, usually the danger comes from the physical abilities of the creature itself. That's what makes it so scary. So to give a Redead a sword feels like the equivalent of arming a skinwalker with a pistol. It suggests that, if it weren't for the pistol in its hand, it wouldn't pose any sort of threat. At this point, it's pretty obvious who our winner is. The Scariest Redead of the Series award goes to none other than Wind Waker. Yes, in a surprising twist of events, the game which you'd least expect to have horror elements within it also includes a variation of Redead. In fact, it's that very contrast from the bright and vibrant art style to the dark and eeriness of places like the Earth Temple which arguably make this even more terrifying. You expect to see at least some darker things in a game like Twilight Princess or even Ocarina of Time, but Wind Waker? Not to mention that these Redeads are a carbon copy of our OGs. Everything about these Redeads just screams terror. Their glowing red eyes, the wide gaping mouth, and pale sickly skin. But what's truly haunting about this version is the ear-piercing shriek it lets out. A scream that reverberates against the claustrophobic walls as it slowly creeps towards its next victim. Congratulations for being our first official candidate in this competition. Sorry, Frank. Maybe next time. On the bright side, this doesn't mean that Ocarina of Time has nothing in it worth discussing. In fact, one other enemy comes to mind, and it's arguably more traumatizing than the Redeads. No, not Phantom Ganon, Dark Link, or even Ganon himself, though these three are scary in their own rights. We must first journey to Kakariko Village. No, the other Kakariko Village. The other Kakariko Village! Thank you. Throughout the game, you frequently return to this place, and eventually you find yourself beneath the well in order to claim its treasure. There's already this sense of discomfort as it's the location Bongo Bongo is sealed. But, as you might have already guessed, Bongo Bongo isn't what we're talking about. You get to the room where the Lens of Truth is, and you see these 4 wiggling hands pointed upwards. Creeped out by this, you cautiously approach one of them until... BAM! This creature straight from hell itself pops out of the ground and slowly makes its way towards you, all while maintaining this unnatural posture. It's almost as if it's hiding its head from you, up until it gets close enough to strike. Then, all of a sudden, jump scare! I don't know what's scarier, the creature's appearance itself, or the way it just wriggles towards you. The official name for this mini-boss is Dead Hand, which also adds some points given how it embraces the whole body horror theme. For many players, the impact this moment had on them was this game's equivalent to the piano monster from Super Mario 64, and it continues to maintain this title. It served as inspiration for countless artworks, some of which portray the creature in a much more realistic and terrifying way, showing just how much of an impact it left on players. But what's truly chilling about this encounter is when you put yourself in the shoes of Link. Imagine confronting this as a child, in a claustrophobic room with nowhere to run. The way it hides itself underground and uses its grotesque mouth to bite you implies that it doesn't see you as a threat. It sees you as its food. Perhaps one day we'll see this enemy return in a future Zelda game. But until then, the Ocarina of Time Dead Hand solidifies itself as one of Zelda's scariest bosses, as well as our second candidate. This whole conversation about body horror and hands reminds me of another enemy, the Wallmaster. In other games, they're instead referred to as Floor Masters, although both function very similarly. The first time you encounter the Wallmaster in Ocarina of Time is always the scariest. All of a sudden, this hand drops down from the ceiling and grabs Link, either taking him back to the dungeon entrance or a specific room. Other titles like A Link Between Worlds are way less scarier, mostly because the hand just hovers over you for a short while before attacking. What makes Ocarina of Time so scary is that initial build-up with that sound effect that starts playing as the small shadow of a hand beneath Link slowly increases in size before the strike. You know what sound I'm talking about, that... I can't. That's my best impression of the sound. I hope you like that. But really, once it happens the first few times, you get used to it real fast. It goes from being scary to more of an annoyance when you accidentally get caught, as it means you have to backtrack to where you once were. It's interesting because the Floor Master of Wind Waker likely served as inspiration for Tears of the Kingdom's Gloom Hands. Are Wallmasters iconic? Most definitely, but still not nearly as iconic as the next enemy we're going to be talking about. Huh? Where did this laser come from? Apologies. There was an, minor setback. Now, picture this. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild has just released, and you excitedly start the game. You're overwhelmed by the sheer size of this world. The possibilities are endless. You decide to take a saunter through Hyrule Field. The weather is clear, birds chirping, the sounds of nature drowning out that subtle yet gentle piano medley that occasionally plays in the background as you look towards Hyrule Castle. You sit there for a moment and take in the sights, and wonder to yourself how it was even possible to make a game as big and as beautiful as the— oh god, it's a Guardian! Run, 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 run! Ever since its first appearance in that initial teaser, the Guardian has solidified itself as one of, if not the most iconic enemies in the series, as well as one of the scariest. This thing is a killing machine, and I imagine that anyone who has played Breath of the Wild still remembers their first run-in with these guys. Not the broken down ones, a full-fledged Guardian. Unlike other enemies in the series, these ones are established as a threat as early as the beginning of the game, where we learn that they're the ones responsible for the Great Calamity. But not only are Guardians deadly, and trust me, they are deadly, they're also fast. Incredibly fast. Even on horseback, their lasers can get you, and don't even think about trying to outrun them yourself. New players will likely spend most of their time either cowering in fear under some cover or just teleporting out of the situation. If only that could solve 90% of life's problems. Sure, getting good with some well-timed parries or equipping the proper gear will make these things a joke, but that can be said with most tough enemies. If anything, it shows how something doesn't need to look scary to be scary. Guardians manage to solidify themselves as one of the most terrifying things without having to introduce cliché elements like body horror or grotesque design. I mean, I guess if you suffer from arachnophobia or something, its appearance will still freak you out. On the topic of being freaked out, let's talk about our next enemy, the Guardians. But NBC, we already talked about the Guardians. I'm not referring to those Guardians. I'm referring to the Guardians. Those which strike fear into even the most experienced gamers. The virgin Breath of the Wild Guardian, useless without its legs, easily one-shot by ancient arrows, can't climb up walls. Versus the Chad Skyward Sword Guardians. Hunt down Link relentlessly, one-shot Link regardless of his strength, and most importantly, can't die. When you first enter the Silent Realm trials, all is peaceful. But the moment you leave that safe zone, all hell breaks loose. Every Guardian in the vicinity wakes up and hunts Link down. As if it weren't already stressful enough, the screen's hue changes to reddish colors, paired with music that really gets your heart going. At this point, your only two options are to either dodge all incoming attacks while making your way to the nearest safe area or tier, or getting hit and having to restart the entire trial. Sure, Breath of the Wild's Guardians are stressful to deal with, but at least you're free to run away or use brute strength to take them down. Meanwhile, the Silent Realms are mandatory. I can only imagine how many players were forced to look up walkthroughs or stop playing entirely. That's the one thing about this enemy though, which to some makes it not nearly as threatening. As long as you plan out your route and tread carefully, avoiding all the waking water and ghost lights, most will be able to get through all 4 trials without ever accidentally waking up these Guardians. But highly forbid you forget a tier on the other side of the map while your last few seconds of safety end. That happens to me all the time in Elden, and because it's a mountain, sometimes I have to climb the entire mountain while avoiding an onslaught of unlimited death and suffering. To this day, I still panic whenever I wake up these Guardians by accident, and while they're not the hardest to dodge, a huge part of it depends on the layout of the level. In some cases, it's quite literally impossible to not get hit. I suppose part of this anxiety comes from the fact that failing means you need to restart the entire challenge, but on the bright side, they're not that lengthy. It's debatable which Guardian people fear most, but it's enough to add both of them to our eligible candidates list. Congratulations! We're about to talk about the final candidate for this competition, and at this point it really shouldn't surprise you as to what that will be, but in the meantime, I want to include an appreciation segment for some of the more obscure enemies in the series. In Link's Awakening, you enter a dream and have to fight its literal nightmare. The boss itself isn't too scary, however the official art better helps to encapsulate the terror of this creature. It's also sort of implied that this boss is taking the forms of Link's own nightmares, adding to that whole fear factor. I've always wanted to cover this in a theory video, but in the meantime there's this one posted by Lady Cucco if that sort of thing interests you. On the topic of scary artwork, one person brought up the Thunderbird from The Adventure of Link, and at first I wasn't sure why, until I took a look at the artwork for it. If I ever had sleep paralysis, this is probably what I'd see. But it could also just be the art style. A lot of older games' official art was drawn in this more realistic way. Imagine this art style being used for official artwork of later monsters like the Redeads and Dead Hand. Now that would be true nightmare fuel. You want to know what else is scary? Trains! Yeah, you heard me correctly. Although I'm not talking about Choo Choo Charles here, unfortunately. For the 90% of people who haven't played Spirit Tracks, which I may add is a very underrated game, there are two types of trains in it, the Dark and Armored train. Once you complete the first dungeon, these bad boys spawn on the tracks. And much like our Guardian friends, one hit from them is all it takes. But in this case, it's game over. Insta-death. Neither of these trains can be destroyed, although shooting them a few times with your cannon will temporarily stun them. What makes it so tricky is how your movement's limited to the track, and if you find yourself in between two oncoming trains, there is quite literally nothing you can do other than wait for your inevitable death. Even if you manage to outsmart one of these trains, they can easily turn around and start moving in the opposite direction. And whenever you get close enough to one of them, this music starts playing, reminding you of the immediate danger. But it's more so an inconvenience than anything else, since sometimes you're forced to take lengthy routes to arrive at your destination. But if I had played this as a kid, these would sort of freak me out. Especially since they are born from the corruption of normal trains, which I can only assume means that its passengers were killed. On the bright side, you can get your revenge on them later in the Dark Realm by collecting Tears of Light and just ramming into them. Die! 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 Speaking of tears, this brings us to the recent game, Tears of the Kingdom. The Cursed Bokoblins! God damn it, I forgot to mention them in this video. Honorable mention worthy, I guess. I would have talked about them and dedicated a whole segment to discussing them because they are really creepy, but unfortunately I just realized I forgot to talk about them, and I'm just finishing this video, so oops. I also want to mention that obviously there are other enemies that I have not talked about, which I can't because of the length of the video. There is more stuff that's scary, but I had to keep it to a select few. So there you go. I absolutely love the way this game opens up, with Link and Zelda exploring the depths of Hyrule Castle. It sets this tone for the rest of the game, and the fact that the journey ends where it began is so cool. With that said, while the storyline of both games include dark elements, few enemies stand out as scary or eerie. Monsters like Bokoblins have a more cutesy sort of design, and then there's the quote-unquote scary monsters such as Lynels and Gleeoks. Yes, they're gonna scare you, but it mostly comes from an intimidation sort of scare. Of course, you're gonna be spooked by something that's extremely powerful to the point where it likely will one-shot you early in the game. However, I believe that King Gleeok at the very least deserves an honorable mention. Imagine using up all of your resources to finally reach the Sky Island above Eventide, only to see this thing flying around. Having 3 separate heads attack you with fire, ice, and lightning is pretty horrifying, especially if you're unprepared for that second phase of the battle. You see the dragon fly high up, and moments later there's this giant fireball being hurled downwards. I wouldn't even say that the Gleeoks are more difficult than the Lynels, especially since there are easier ways to cheese them with homing arrows, but they are much more intimidating. In fact, the only mini-boss which truly scared me is the Frox. Since they're found in the depths, often you'll see this singular glowing eye in the dark. Even if you try to light up the surrounding area before fighting them, Frox will eat any bright bloom seeds they can see. But what's the scariest part about this mini-boss is how you think you're safe above ground, only to see one of these things lunge at you from the ground. and they can jump extremely high when doing so. It sure gave me a fright when I first saw it. The music that plays while fighting a frog sounds like it was ripped directly out of a horror film. There's even one part that sounds exactly like that cliché strange sound effect present in many scary movies. But just like the Gleeoks, they can easily be beaten with a couple Keese arrows. Okay, enough beating around the bush. You all know what we're discussing next. Those damn hands. Dear Hylia, the first time I came across these things, I just about jumped out of my own skin. I didn't even realize they were there at first. I was minding my own business opening a chest, only to drop down and see these things making a beeline towards me. All while the atmosphere shifted, not unlike what you'd see during a blood moon, this eerie music blasting in my ear. Similar to the Guardians, they cannot be outran on foot. But rather than keeping some distance while shooting lasers, these guys prefer the physical treatment. They latch onto you like Redeads, sapping away your life force. And because it's a monster made from gloom, the attacks deal gloom damage. The Gloom Spawn is essentially this game's equivalent of Guardians. But which one is scarier? In my opinion, it has to be the Gloom Spawn. For one, the entire atmosphere shifts to a blood red once these enemies spot you. Second, even after you defeat the hands, Phantom Ganon pops up out of nowhere, forcing yourself into a mini-boss fight. I imagine that a lot of people were caught off guard by this and still trying to recover from that initial encounter. And most importantly, these hands will literally spawn in out of nowhere. At least for Guardians, you can sort of keep an eye out for them in the distance. However, the Gloom Spawn only appears once you get close enough for it to spot you. Yes, it does have set locations where it appears, however, it gives off that impression that this enemy can show up anywhere. Plus, if you don't destroy all the hands quick enough, they will regenerate, which discourages players from battling them head-on. Even in the late game, when I'm well equipped to the point where I could easily take them, I usually either run and avoid them, or if I do fight them, it's at an adequate distance where I'm spamming bomb arrows. It says a lot about how even after well over 200 hours of playtime, I still don't want to mess with these things. They might be easier to fight than Guardians, but I wouldn't know, because I'm still too scared to approach them. It's just the fact that they appear out of nowhere that's so eerie. The only thing that I wish was changed about them was that this would happen anywhere in the world rather than set locations. A big thing that holds back the Guardians from being scarier than the Gloom Spawn is the difference between the in-game version and the ones depicted in cutscenes. Guardians would have been way more terrifying if they really could climb up structures as seen in Rome's cutscene. It would have also been cool to witness them emerging out of the Hyrule Castle columns. One bit of concept art in Creating a Champion shows this, as well as a cutscene in Age of Calamity. Now that we've talked about all 5 candidates, which one is Zelda's scariest? It's a very difficult decision, especially since each pick has its own strengths and weaknesses, although for me personally, the Gloom Hands are the ones that come out on top. Yes, it might be because of recency bias, but these monsters really did come out of nowhere when playing the game for the first time. I hadn't even considered the possibility of the Zelda team including a replacement for the Guardians. But it's important to understand that, for many people, the reasons why they find one thing much scarier than the others often has to do with when you encountered it, the lasting impression said thing had on you, or if it's something that you remember so well because it's from your favorite game. Confronting something like Dead Hand as a kid would no doubt leave a bigger impression on you than if you were an adult. And even then, there are countless reaction videos on YouTube showing men and women freaking out the first time they confront the Gloom Spawn. It's also important to remember how Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom introduced an entire new generation of people into the Zelda series. A lot of kids are currently having that Dead Hand or Redead moment with the Gloom Hands, and it's going to stick with them for a very long time. Very strange to think that 20-ish years down the line, we're going to be looking back at the Gloom Spawn in the same regard as to how current-day adults look back at their first time playing Ocarina of Time and the fear they felt towards confronting these monsters. Plus, everyone's definition of fear is going to be different. You might be unfazed by body horror or grotesque appearances, but the mere sight of a completely normal clown or something puts you into a panic. Like many things, this is a subjective topic, and while the main point of this video is to find the scariest enemy, it's more so about the journey, not the destination. I hope you enjoyed this video, and make sure to subscribe for more Zelda-related content. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go look for Frank. I think I hear him bothering the neighbors again.